first thing I did was tape a bunch of paper down to my floor so that I could sketch out a full-sized template of the Nimbus 2000. For the handle, I was using a piece of 1-inch diameter PVC conduit that I planned to put the bends in using a heat gun. So I wanted a template that would be the exact length so that I could bend the pipe right over the template so that everything lined up exactly where I wanted it. I sketched out the broom using some reference photos that I pulled up on my phone. I had the pipe laying there so that I could get the diameter of the handle correct, and I pretty much just freehanded the tail based on the photos. Now, I looked at some other reference photos of Harry holding the broom and decided that it should be about 5 feet long, 3 feet handled, 2 feet tail. That ended up being almost spot on. The tail was a little short of 2 feet and the handle was a little longer, but after it was pushed into the tail, I think it ended up being a little bit shorter. Once the template was done, I moved it to my desk because I didn't want to build the whole thing while sitting on the floor. My next step was to shape the front of the PVC into the smooth, gentle curve that you see on the nose of the Nimbus 2000. I was using the end of the PVC that was flared out to be a pipe coupler because I thought the extra plastic would give me a little more to work with to make that widened curve shape. I heated it up with a heat gun and bent the front down so that it would match the top of the curve, and then I heated it up more so that I could smush it flat because it obviously was flared out on the sides also. It was a little harder than I was expecting to get the front completely flat, so this took a lot of heating and smushing, and I tried to use a wood block there. That didn't go great. Eventually I ended up just clamping it in the vise and applying a little heat. For the underside of the curve, just bending the pipe down kind of left a very angular kink there, as you can kind of see right here. It's very angular, so what I did was I heated that area and then I used the nail claw on the hammer. I used the back side of that to push into the pipe to get a nice gentle curve. That ended up working out really well because it was about the curve that I wanted, and also the cold metal cooled the pipe pretty quick and held it in that shape. I ended up using the hammer again here to do the middle of the handle bends. I just marked out the beginning bend and the end bend, heated the pipe, and then bent it around the handle. This was a lot easier to bend than the tip because there was a lot more broom to work with that I could hold on either side that wasn't, scorching hot. So I just bent it around the hammer, and once it was cooled, that was the general shape of the broom handle. Next, I started to sculpt the nose of the broom into a much cleaner shape. I had to cut a little off with a utility knife to make it fit the curve better, so I just cut that off and sanded it. Then I took some modeling clay and started to make the wider curve shape that is the nose of the broom. This modeling clay isn't the best material to use. In hindsight, maybe like a plumber's epoxy would have been better, but I had this lying around and I was too cheap and lazy to go buy something else, so I used this. It also has the benefit of drying kind of like a foam, and I thought that might be good for the nose of the broom to be kind of soft and have some give in case it was banged on things. Next, I marked off on the handle where it was going to fit into the tail with a thick black marker so that I could still see the line once I covered the entire handle in masking tape. Now, the reason I did this is because I was going for more of a wood grain look than the bare plastic itself. I tested this technique on a scrap piece of the PVC before I did the broom, and by laying the tape lengthwise so that all of the seams and any creases are in the same direction as the handle, and then painting with brush strokes that same way, it actually ends up looking pretty decently like wood, at least a lot better than just the bare plastic. The paint also didn't stick great to just the plastic, and you could see the text on the plastic through. I could have just cleaned that off, but it was kind of flaking, and I decided to go with the tape anyway, which also helped a lot with the wood grain look. I used long pieces on the straightaways, but when I got to the curves, I used a lot smaller pieces to try to cut down on the creases, because a couple of the creases kind of helps with the wood grain look, but too many, it becomes apparent that this is just tape, not wood. So I used smaller pieces so that they would bend a little more and smooth better to the surface. And once I was done with the long part of the handle, I went back to the nose and covered that in tape too. That took a lot of really small pieces because the curves were so tight. But I just cut them out with an Exacto knife and shaped it as best I could. I rounded the edges, and once I was done, I ended up covering the sides of the nose shape with one solid piece to hide as many of the seams as I could, because there was a lot going on there. Now it was time to paint the handle. I used a foam paintbrush and a light brown color, and made sure to keep my brush strokes going lengthwise down the handle to help with that wood grain appearance that I talked about before. While I was painting this, I painted the nose and the tail, and then I was kind of stuck with my hand in the middle, so I just painted up to that point where my hand was, and then laid it on the vise to dry. I don't really know why I did this. It probably would have been, more sensible to paint one end and then the other end, but I just left a spot in the middle and then filled that in later. Then I started working on the tail. The entire inside of the tail was made of cardboard so that I could cut down on the number of twigs that I would need to collect later. So I took this toilet paper tube and I wrapped it around a scrap piece of the same size conduit that I used for the handle, so that it would slide right onto the end of the handle, and then I could screw it in place once everything was painted and ready to be assembled. So I cut the toilet paper tube to the right diameter, and then I taped it back together around the pipe so that I could just slide this pipe out and slide the handle in when I was ready. I cut a little circle here to be an end cap on that, but that wasn't really necessary because that part's hidden deep within the tail of the broom. Then I took some corrugated cardboard and cut a strip, which I hot glued to the front of the tail. That will be the flat edge that all of the ends of the twigs are glued onto. Next, I took a longer piece of cardboard tube from the inside of a wrapping paper roll and put that on the end to make up the main bulk of the length of the tail. I squished down the tail end of the tail into a point so that the twigs would come to a nice edge, and then I took more corrugated cardboard and more duct tape and just rolled it around, building up the shape of the Nimbus 2000 tail.
Alright, so now we're going outside to find some sticks for the tail of the broom. We're going to find some thin twigs, and we have our wagon to carry them in, and we have our tree scissors. So yeah, now we just have to find some really straight sticks.
Luckily, we were able to find some twigs that would work. Along the edge of our woods, there was a bunch of these bushes that had very straight branches, so we just cut down all the ones that were long enough to cover the handle, and I brought them back to the house and then went through the painstakingly slow process of trimming off all of the leaves and knots and nubs with a pair of side snips. This was the most exhausting part of the entire broom process, and the best part was we got nowhere near enough sticks, so I ended up making 2 more trips back to the woods, coming back with wagons full of twigs, cleaning them all off just to have enough to adequately fill out the tail of the broom and hide all of the cardboard beneath it. Once I had the twigs cleaned and cut, I brought them back inside and began to measure them to the right length and wrap them around the cardboard. When we gathered all of the twigs, we made sure to cut them plenty long enough so that when I brought them inside, I could cut them to size if I needed to, because you can always take stuff away, but it's a lot harder to put it back. So I ended up with a lot of cut off pieces that weren't quite long enough to reach the whole length of the broom, and when I cut them, I made sure to cut that shorter side on the bottom end of the branch that was thicker and not quite as pliable, because I wanted the thinner and the more flexible ones for the whole length. I ended up taking a lot of these cut off pieces and wrapping them around the middle to be an underlayer that I could tape down at both ends and hold securely, but that way when you can kind of see through the cracks in the outer layer, you still see twigs. So all of those cut off pieces ended up helping out quite a lot to kind of build up the middle bulk of the broom. And as you can see here, I have a whole bunch of them taped on, but I haven't even started the top layer yet that will go all the way down. Here I took a pair of side snips and I made sure to trim down all of the ends of this underlayer at an angle so that they wouldn't stick out of the outer layer once it was coming down toward the end of the tail there. I balled up some tape so that it would be sticky on both sides and wrapped it around the end before I started putting the twigs on so that it would kind of hold them in place, but that didn't end up working well at all, so I took rubber bands instead and wrapped them on both ends of the tail. Then I just fished them between and went around the entire circumference of the tail, adding more and more and more twigs. And 2 trips to the woods to get more twigs later, the tail was finally done. So I inserted the handle and used zip ties to replace the rubber bands to hold the front end down. One zip tie by itself wasn't long enough, so I linked 2 together and then tightened them down with pliers and snipped the ends off. I put one on each side of the rubber band, and these also were just temporary because my plan was to use this tin banding to tie it down more permanently. That way I could put a screw through it that would go all the way into the broom handle and keep it from pulling out of the tail. So I cut the banding to the right length and tightened it as much as I physically could, drilled a hole, and screwed it on. Once that one was in place, I could remove the rubber band and the zip tie because that was holding it pretty effectively. Then I took some tape and I cut it to the thicknesses of the decorative gold bands that are going to go over top of the actual structural bands that I'm adding here. So I put tape on to kind of line up where I wanted those, and then I took more of the tin banding, wrapped it around, and cut it and screwed it on. Getting this tin banding to lie straight was really difficult because I was applying a flat band to a curved surface, but after fiddling with it a while, I got it about where I wanted it, and once it was covered with the gold, it ended up looking okay. Once the banding was done, I went about strengthening the other end of the broom by pumping the tips of the twigs full of hot glue and then clamping down on them with my hand until it was dry. I knew that wasn't going to be quite sturdy enough, considering that this end of the broom was going to have to support weight when it was standing up on the pedals. So I took some thread and I wrapped it around to give it some extra support here and hold the twigs down on the outer layers. I tied the thread to the twigs and I wrapped it around. I wove in and out of some and did multiple passes to make sure that it was good and sturdy. Once I tied it off, I used hot glue on the knots so that they wouldn't pull out, and I used some hot glue on some other just troublesome twigs that would pop up. I made sure those ones were glued down very thoroughly. Once the gluing was done, I cleaned up the end with some side snips so that it would be nice and clean, and then moved back to the top of the broom. Now when I put the outer layer of twigs on, I left some overhang so that I could take the cut off pieces and use them to cover up the cardboard underneath. So I just cut them all to about 1 centimeter in length and glued them inside. After I was done, I masked off the handle and took the broom outside to spray paint the tail a good dark brown color. Next, I moved on to the decorative gold bands that were going to cover the metal bands that were already on the broom. I was going to use a soda bottle for this, but it ended up not being long enough once I cut it along the diameter to make it all the way around at the topmost band, so I used this plastic instead. It's the kind of plastic that comes on the front of a toy box when there's like a window so you can see the toy inside. I tend to save this because it comes in handy, and this piece was plenty long enough to wrap all the way around the broom. So I just cut it into strips. The two smaller ones were 3/4 inch thick, and the wider one was 1.25 inches. Once I had them cut and measured, I taped them down to a piece of cardboard and took them outside to spray paint gold. Now for the pedal apparatus, I made this wire template so that I could bend it around the tail of the broom to make sure that it was the right size and the curves were correct. But this wouldn't hold it up if it was really attached, so I made the real pedal setup out of 3/8 inch brake line that I got in an auto parts store. I took the brake line and put it in my vise and used a pipe cutter to cut off the flared end so that I could remove those little brass nuts. The original piece of brake line was 30 inches long, and I ended up cutting about 1/2 inch off each side to remove the flaring. I also used another piece that was a foot long before cutting to make the little front guard on the pedal assembly. I marked off the center of the pipe so the sides would be even, and I took it outside to the vise to bend it. I first bent the brake line completely in half at center by clamping a screwdriver into the vise and bending it around that. Since I didn't have a pipe bender to do the other bends, I used some unorthodox methods. As you can see here, I'm fooling around with some socket wrench heads. I tried clamping those into the vise and using it to bend the flare out for the hinge, but that didn't work well, so I ended up just shoving it in the vise and bending it out that way. I left about 2 inches high for that hinge piece there, and at the other end I left about 6 inches for the pedals, which I then bended back in half, so each pedal is about 3 inches long.
So the camera ran out of memory while I was building the pedal situation, and I actually don't have footage of a lot of it. So I'm just gonna catch us up on what has happened. So I took the brake line that I had that used to look like this. I have an extra one. And I bent it following this wire shape that I made with just a coat hanger and like a scrap of wire, and I just sized this to the broom. It's like, okay, that's kind of the general shape, and I used that as kind of like a guide to bend this. I bent it on the vise using just a rubber mallet mostly. I just cranked the mallet into the vise and then bent the tube around the mallet kind of incrementally. So do like a small bend, move it down, do a small bend. That's how I got like the shallow curve. And then I JB welded this piece to this piece, right in this area, but that's not like super strong, and I think one of them might have broken loose. But I just put tape here, masking tape, because I did the same process with the feet that I did with the end of the broom. So I filled it with clay, wrapped with masking tape. It's not gonna look super professional. An epoxy putty would probably be better than, you know, tape and clay, but I didn't want to go get epoxy putty. So I did this. Then I took and I drilled a hole through here. I don't know if you can see me through the hole, but yeah, I drilled a hole that is the size of this little machine bolt, and so that goes through there. And then I took, this little plate thing is going to be the hinge that this sits into and then folds back against the broom. This is a piece from an erector set that I just bent. It was just a flat piece with 5 holes in it, and then I bent it into this little kind of U shape around this, so I gauged it off of this. And then I took some scrap plastic from painting these strips of plastic for going over the bands. I had some that I test painted just to see what the color was going to look like. So I took a piece of that, I cut it out to the same size as the piece of plastic, and I wrapped it around, and I just put a little double-sided tape on the bottom to hold it in place, and I punched some holes in there for the screws, and this is a screw that's going to go down into the broom, into the pipe, and it's a screw that's got like a little, it's a little bit proud of the hole, and that is so, I picked this screw specifically because it'll stop. Let me flip this. Okay. So when this is on the broom like this, and I can actually just put the bolt in, that would be easier. So, let me, oh, I forgot this is a little tight. Hold on. Okay. The plastic made the bolt a little bit tight, so let me just put the nut on. Okay, I have the hinge assembled, and then I'm going to have to take it apart so that I can paint this and screw this on. But it's okay, it's fine, everything's okay. So, why I'm using the screw that is proud of the surface a little bit, I took just a file, and I filed this point down here, so if you can see, if I line it up parallel, this side was a little raised, just from the bending, it bended, and then the brake line kinked, and it had little ears kind of on the ends. So I filed this one off, but I left this one up, so that the hinge moves freely this way, but it stops here. So that screw hits that little protrusion from the pipe, so it won't bend further forward so that it'll lock into the kickstand position, but then it will fold up this way against the broom. And I'm kind of counting on just friction to hold this against the excuse me. I'm kind of counting on friction to just hold this against the broom. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, now my next step is to take this whole assembly back off, paint this the same chrome gold, and then I will screw the straps to the broom, these plastic straps that are the gold, screw this in place, bolt it back on, and then I'm very, very close to being done.
Once the pedals were painted, I took the gold bands that I spray painted earlier, I cut them to the right length and punched holes in them so that I could screw them on. Now, when I screwed on the metal bands that hold the twigs together earlier, I made a mistake. When I screwed them on from the bottom almost dead center, which is where the screws for the plastic bands need to go. They should be on the outside, dead center, on the bottom of the broom. What I should have done is taken the metal bands and screwed those in from the top, since those are going to be covered and you don't see them. So for the two smaller bands, the screws on the bottom are just a little off center, and since the hinge screws in to the bands also, and that had to be center, I actually had to take out one of the screws that was holding the metal band in place and then thread the hinge screw through the plastic, through the hinge, and through the metal band so that it would be dead center on the bottom of the broom. That was very, very difficult to do and could have been avoided if I would have just planned ahead a little more and done the first screws from the top and just made sure that there was a hole that was lined up center on the bottom for these screws to go into later. Once the bands were screwed on, I bolted the pedal assembly back into the hinge, and then all that was left to do was paint the Nimbus logo on the front of the broom. So here's the finished broomstick. Full disclosure, it has been 8 months since I made this, which is why the desk is here now. But I just now got around editing the video and thought we needed an outro. Also, I wanted to talk a little bit about the logo on the front because I never filmed me painting that on. So, if you could see, the Nimbus logo is stenciled on the front there, and to make that, all I did was print off the logo, and then I took some painter's tape and I traced out the profile of the broom nose, and then I used an Exacto knife to trace the Nimbus logo on there. Then I just taped it on and masked off the rest of the broom and hit it with some gold spray paint. So I think that was pretty much everything that I forgot to cover in the building portion of the video. But since it has been 8 months since I've made it, you kind of can see a little wear, and so I can talk about that a little bit. Some paint kind of came off on the gold bands, so in hindsight probably should have sprayed those with some lacquer before I put them on to kind of hold all that together. But other than that, I think it's held up pretty well. What would you say? Oh, this is a little loose too. It pivots, so maybe I could have put a little cross piece and a second screw to keep that in line. But it's doing okay. It lives up in Natalie's room. I made it for her when I made it to replace her old broom. So, what do you think?
I think it's great. This was my old broom. It was a firebolt that I got off of eBay for like 20 bucks. And I'd say the broom Ian made is definitely an upgrade. This one is extremely short compared to this one. This is definitely a better size. And I don't know if this is a toothbrush, but it just
Yeah,
it sucks. That's what it is.
I've always thought that was a weird decision
So,
what they did there, but
luckily I don't even have to think about that broom anymore because I have this.
that one, that kind of broom seems to be about the only one that you can buy other than like the Noble Collection replicas, which are like several $100s. For this, all I paid for, I think, was the brake line. I had everything else. I had the pipe, but PVC pipe about that size is maybe $5, and I think I spent $20 on brake line. Between, I got 3 pieces. I got 2 of the long ones just because I didn't know if I'd have enough, but I ended up just using one of the long ones and one of the short ones. So like $25, and then a sizable investment in time walking around the woods, collecting sticks, looking like a crazy person. So I will try to put a full list of all the materials I used in the description. Thanks for watching, and if you try to make your own Nimbus 2000, be sure to let us know in the comments below.
Bye!